Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for another story this evening. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. My name is Katrina, and I was born and raised in Charleston, West Virginia. When I was 25 in 1978, I fell passionately in love with a debonair, handsome, rugged and easygoing man called Cole, who actually was a cattle rancher. Anyone will tell you that if you're beguiled and bedazzled by a rancher, you also need to ingratiate yourself towards the quintessential rural, provincial, rustic lifestyle. You'll invariably also have to cherish horses and cows because they become such an intrinsic part of your daily life in the running and managing of a ranch. Luckily for me, I've always been an impassioned animal lover with a wholehearted, zealous and spirited affinity for the natural world, always preferring to be out of doors, spending time in nature, and not concerning myself with fancy hairstyles, loads of makeup and fashionable clothes. Instead, I like to wear a cowgirl hat, a pair of jeans, a plaid shirt, and a pair of cowboy boots, and I'm pretty much as happy as a dog rolling around in the mud. I like living in a relaxed, easygoing way. When Cole and I were married, I immediately moved into his huge ranch-style home that had previously belonged to his father, who was now a retired rancher, and was living in the coast in Oregon with his beautiful wife Mona. Our prepossessing, rather swanky-looking home was nestled in the heart of an exquisite-looking valley, surrounded by undulating green hills, mountainous valleys, grazing pastures, white wooden poled fences, a pond, a creek, 3 barns, and ubiquitous trees scattered liberally across the picturesque, bodacious landscape. It would seem that I settled down to an idyllic Elysian country life, rather like a duck to water, whilst managing the domestic priorities like cleaning, cooking and shopping. I received a great deal of gratification helping my husband Cole around his ranch, with mucking out of the stables, grooming and exercising the horses, as well as interacting with the cows. My inscrutable, rather incongruous story begins when I decided to take my 2 beloved golden retrievers, Eskimo Pie and Poochie Pie, for their daily walks by a local lake in an area teeming with ducks and waterfowl. It was a very serene, tranquil oasis, bounded by acres of rolling green turf, plentiful trees and countless walking trails. Cole thought I was crazy to indulge my dogs in this extravagant way, and was insistent that our large ranch was sufficiently sizable and ample enough for our 2 energetic, very rambunctious, high-spirited retrievers for them to run around and explore. While this was indeed true, it was never ever about the space, as that wasn't an issue for me at all. I was determined that both my dogs were well socialised with other dogs, but I also secretly enjoyed meeting up with some of my girlfriends. I loved sitting on the wooden benches and talking while we watched our rollicking dogs go diving into the water, retrieving sticks and running around happily while they played with all kinds of other dogs, from beagles, poodles, collies, Great Danes, pinchers, bull terriers, you name it, so much more. Any bystander would wisely perceive that this social interaction for the dogs was terribly significant, but it was also a pleasant escape for me to engage in some light-hearted banter with my girlfriends, as in those days we didn't have the social media platforms that they invariably have today, where people can connect together. On this particular day, I vividly recall arriving at the lake earlier than usual and opening the trunk to let out my boisterous golden retrievers, who were hyped up, energised and very excited, as much like any dog, they always appreciated a trip away from home. Before long, they were bounding exuberantly along the lush green grass, smelling the ground furiously and lifting their leg at every available opportunity to make their distinctive life-affirming mark. I was bewildered that there were not many dogs or people around, but maybe it was because it was particularly early. It was a glorious day with some lovely warm sunshine and a refreshing cool breeze that was blowing against my face. Everything looked beguiling and magically enchanting as the large silvery lake seemed to sparkle in the morning sun, and its gleaming surface reflected the clouds in the sky, along with the tall statuesque trees, that flanked its outer perimeters. "Hi there," chided Philippa, one of my girlfriends that I'd known for many years. She came ambling towards me with her two friendly, rather peppy Jack Russells, who came hurtling towards my dogs at lightning speed, only too eager to greet them, with lots of sniffing and very vigorous tail wagging. "I've not seen you around lately. How are things going at the ranch with that new husband of yours? That was some wedding, by the way." "Oh, fine," I said. "Everything's hunky-dory." "Well, I see ranch life suits you rather well," she chuckled. "You seem to be positively glowing. But who can blame you? You snagged yourself one hell of a catch with that rancher husband of yours. He's so attractive and good-looking, with a great sense of humour, I might add." "Thanks a lot," I said. "I know he is. I am very lucky." "Something's up with my dogs today," said Philippa, referring to her two boisterous Jack Russells that liked to chase everything in sight and were pretty fearless. "What do you mean?" I asked. "They look perfectly fine to me." "Well, they're fine now, but you should have seen them earlier on. They behaved very weird. We were rambling around the Sylvan," she said, "and they weren't acting right. They were skittish and spasmodic and fearful. It was exceedingly odd. I've never seen them like this before. They couldn't actually wait to leave the woods. Normally it's their favourite part of the walk, but certainly not today." "That's weird," I admitted. "I've never known your Jack Russells to be frightened of anything. I wonder what got them so spooked." "I think there's something in the woods there," said Philippa, lowering her voice to a silent whisper. "I know it sounds odd, but I really thought something was exceedingly off. I got the awful sense that somebody was watching me. It was so ominous and disquieting. It gave me the heebie-jeebies. I've never felt so unsettled before." "Well, maybe it was a vagrant," I suggested. "He was possibly just spying on you." "Of course you're right," said Philippa. "That must be it," she said, looking heartily relieved, as if in some way I'd reassured her. "But whoever he was, I will tell you this, he freaked my dogs out, and they didn't like him one little bit, because Biscuit here kept growling, and she does not get aggressive. She hasn't got a nasty bone in that body of hers." I didn't even give Philippa's concerns a moment's thought, as I had known her for many years. She was recognised in town for being a hypochondriac that literally overreacted to just about everything. If she had a cold, she had pneumonia. If she sprained her ankle, she believed that she had become crippled for life. I remember one time she cut herself with a kitchen knife, barely even grazing her skin, but she firmly believed that she was bleeding to death. I had to drive her to hospital at lightning speed, and she howled the entire way like a great big baby. I was hardly about to take anything she said seriously, because whatever she professed was almost certainly to be highly exaggerated. I bid her farewell and went on my merry way, venturing towards the pristine silvery lake, where I indulged my dogs' hearty expectations and threw a few sticks in the lake for them to fetch. Before long they were shaking their long shaggy coats and spraying my jeans with water. We then trekked towards the Sylvan. I love this part of the walk best, because the hiking trails are so phenomenal and are well maintained by the Forestry Commission, and the statuesque trees with their colossal trunks literally tower into the sky like resplendent-looking giants, with their emerald leafy heads providing a sumptuous canopy above us, which allowed the mellow, subdued and gentle shafts of sunlight to dance through the branches. The forest floor was adorned with lacy leaves of delicate ferns and flowering creepers. As I entered this heavenly wooded sanctuary, I surmised that Philippa was actually right. Why had I been so quick to dismiss her claims? There was something distinctly off about the woods this morning, and it was sending chills down my spine and making me feel very discomposed. I suddenly realised how insanely quiet everything had become. I perceived that the woods were devoid of the usual musical tweets and warbles from the pretty bird song. I had actually once heard my father claim that if everything became very still in a woods, it could mean that a predator was lurking around furtively in the shadows, waiting to pounce on its unsuspecting prey. This horrifying revelation did not bode well with me, and only sparked in me an amplified sense of consternation. So I reached out for a piece of timber as a precautionary measure, should I need to defend myself from some loitering predator, like a mountain lion or something else. It was oddly reassuring and comforting to see that my ecstatic, jubilant, rambunctious dogs were seemingly unfazed. They were zooming down the hiking trails, sniffing the ground attentively, as if they were in heaven. It seemed that some kind of intoxicating, alluring scent had really enthralled them and got their immediate attention. They ran far ahead of me, abandoning me way ahead on the trail. "Come back now, Eskimo Pie," I called. "Come back now." But it was to no avail, and my dog ignored my frantic, persistent calls. I really hated it when they did this to me. I knew when my dogs encountered a thrilling scent, all their obedience training went flying out of the window and was quickly forgotten and unlearnt. I sighed in frustration and continued to walk. In a trice, I really sensed that something supremely sinister and insidious was staring at me. It was a menacing, inauspicious feeling. I frantically looked around the wood and saw nothing there. I can't describe this creepy, baleful feeling to you, only that it was causing my heart to pump violently in my chest. My face began to break out in a cold sweat. In the wind, I caught a whiff of the most awful odour that reminded me of hot, sweaty trash that had gone rancid. Perhaps there really was a smelly, unkept vagabond camped out here in the woods, I thought, after all. That was when I heard this dismaying, pugnacious, low guttural growl. It was unlike anything I've ever heard before. My primal gut instinct was to run out of the sylvan as fast as I possibly could, but my dogs were further up the trail, and I just could not abandon them like that. It was then that I noticed some small saplings swaying menacingly backwards and forwards, but this was not an action caused by a gentle breeze. Of that I was assured. That was when I discerned a dark silhouette moving between the brush. I could see an ominous shadowy outline that looked rather like a bear, but I knew instinctively that this was no bear. What on earth was it, I wondered? Then I saw him as he pulled back the verdant undergrowth like a large shower curtain. He stood there brewing for a moment, leering at me with his savage, deep-set black eyes. Then he came charging out of the thicket, thundering towards me like an incensed, raging bull that was volatile, antagonistic, and explosive. I was in absolute shock. I couldn't believe what I was discerning with my eyes. It was like the obnoxious, cold-blooded monster on the pages of pulp fiction had suddenly taken on bodily form and become alive, entering our reality. Words cannot do justice in expressing the escalating, portentous terror I felt in those vital seconds. I stood there, completely frozen to the spot. If I was desirous to run, I could not have done so. It was like my whole body just disengaged and shut down, failing brilliantly to cooperate with my woolly brain. My mind kept screaming, "Run! Girl, run, run!" But I simply could not move a muscle. I'd seemingly grown incapacitated and paralysed by the most overwhelming sense of impending dread. I had become like a pathetic ready meal waiting to be served up to a hungry predator without putting on any resistance whatsoever. I even dropped the timber stick that I'd been holding for the self-defence that I'd planned, because fighting this creature off would ultimately seal my destined deadly fate, without a shadow of a doubt. What on earth was wrong with me, I wondered? I was living on borrowed time, and my life was flashing before me. And yet I was just standing there like a lumbering idiot, unable to move. I assumed I was already foredoomed, pretty much dead. Well, I would be in any second, and that condemning thought hit me like a ton of bricks. But I still could not move a muscle. The voracious creature was standing yards away from me. He began pounding his chest defiantly, as if to establish his dominance and authority over me. It was like he was ridden with testosterone. It was almost as if he was saying, "This is my territory, and I don't want you in here." I stared at this thing with terrified eyes that grew as wide as saucers, and I began to tremble like a jelly. This audacious creature was demoniacal in appearance, and seemed malevolent and evil. Everything about him made my skin crawl, as he was quite literally the most treacherously dangerous beast that I have ever encountered in my entire life. Truly I would have been more comfortable and at ease in the presence of an aggressive lion than this hideously grotesque, virtuous being that with one strike from his hand could swat me dead, much like an annoying fly. What on earth was he, I wondered? It would seem that he was humanoid with very distinctive ape-like influences to his appearance, but it was hard to discriminate one from another. The critter stood on 2 feet, at easily over 8 foot tall. His titanic-sized body was powerful, majestic, lofty, and very strong. If you had told me he was bulletproof, I would definitely have believed you. This thing, whatever on God's earth it was, exuded immense power and was built like a solid, hefty machine. Every part of this creature's body was densely thick with sinewy muscular definition, most especially his ample upper torso, not to mention his gargantuan-sized shoulders that were exceedingly impressive. I noticed he possessed a bullet-shaped head that blended seamlessly into the shoulders, and I did not discern a neck. The creature had very long arms that hung well below the knees, and very long, lean legs. He was covered from head to toe with long, shaggy, raven-coloured hair, and he had an oval face with a masculine, very square jawline, a prominent, deeply furrowed brow, and very wide, flat nose, and deep-set black eyes that were hostile, cold, and exceedingly threatening. I watched in absolute horror as the critter continued to thump his chest with his powerful fists, as though he was beating a drum. Indeed, it sounded like that. He began to growl at me, curling his lips back to expose his sizable human-like teeth. Suddenly the critter was momentarily distracted by the unexpected, spontaneous appearance of both of my dogs that came bounding past us, barely giving me a second glance. Eskimo Boy's fixed gaze was on Poochie Pie, who had her mouth clammed down tightly, much like an oyster shell, over the trophy that she was carrying in her mouth. Eskimo Boy clearly wanted to pilferage it from her, whatever it was, but she was sprinting far ahead, disallowing Eskimo Boy to get even remotely close to her. So there she was, Poochie Pie, who had no intention of giving up her prize, and went tearing past me through the sylvan with Eskimo Boy in hot pursuit of her, rather like a police officer chasing an offender. In that second, while the critter's distracted attention was focused on my dogs, I seized this golden opportunity to escape, and suddenly I found my legs again, with a surge of adrenaline, and I sprinted through the wood green as fast as a cheetah. I was terrified that this ghastly creature would chase us, but he didn't. I continued to run as fast as a bat out of hell, never stopping once to draw breath, not even for a moment, nor to even acknowledge any of my friends who had arrived at the lake to walk their dogs. I went tearing past them. I could actually hear them greeting me, but I didn't acknowledge them at all. I hastily opened the trunk for my dogs, and they jumped into the back, and I closed the door behind them as quickly as I could. I dived onto the car seat, started up the engine, and accelerated out of the car park, so fast, while I could see my friends looking on with astonished faces that conveyed what they were clearly thinking. What on earth is up with her? I could hear my dogs in the back of the car fighting continuously over the trophy that Poochie Pie had retrieved from the woods. I pulled over to the side of the road and finally parked. I was shaking so much that I had to calm myself down, or I knew I would crash my car and end up in a horrific, ghastly car accident. I had just escaped death once today. I was not in a hurry to face it all over again. I knew I needed to decompress, loosen up, relax, and calm down. I began to take some soothing, deep breaths, breathing ever so deeply into a brown paper bag to settle my nerves and to regain some self-control. That thing could have killed me, I thought to myself. I'm so lucky to have escaped with my life still intact. Poochie Pie continued to growl at Eskimo Boy, so once I'd mellowed out, I went over to the back of the trunk and demanded that she drop whatever it was that she had in her mouth, but she was refusing to oblige and began growling even at me, which was simply not acceptable. I'd never seen her behave like this before. She seemed particularly possessive over what it was she had in her mouth. Poochie Pie was always picking up nasty, decomposing, dead trophies from the woods, and I knew that she possibly had a disgusting dead rat in her mouth. But nothing was about to prepare me for what I was about to uncover in the next few seconds. "Drop it, Pooch! Drop it now! Now! Drop it!" I snapped in an angry tone that even surprised and startled her. Obediently, she dropped the animal out of her mouth, and imagine my absolute astonishment when Pooch dropped a decomposing hand and wrist with a signet ring still attached to the tiny finger. I let out a huge scream as I observed the macabre, gruesome, chewed-up hand on the floor of my trunk. I began to hyperventilate in shock as a reaction to what I was seeing. Could this day get any worse, I wondered. Finally, I managed to simmer down, and wrinkling my nose in disgust, I reluctantly grabbed the gnarled, lifeless hand with a plastic glove and tossed it into a brown paper bag, much like a burger at a fast food joint, and rolled up the package ever so tightly. There are no words to describe how I was feeling at this point in time. It was disturbing, to say the least, to find a human hand embedded in my dog's mouth, but I was in no doubt who was responsible for dismembering this human being that I assumed must have been a lone dog walker who'd been violently attacked by the hideous, uncongenial monster that I had beheld. This could have been my hand, I thought in horror. I pressed down the accelerator and raced to the police station as fast as I possibly could. I needed to report this grisly murder at once and to present them with the incriminating evidence. As I entered the glass doors with my brown paper bag rolled up in my hand, I noticed the station was very quiet, apart from an elderly lady who was sitting on a chair waiting to see an officer about her nasty next-door neighbour, whom she believed emphatically had kidnapped and stolen her Persian cat. I raced to reception and insisted on seeing the chief inspector immediately on a matter of the strictest urgency. "You have to wait your turn, love, like everybody else," said the policeman behind the desk in a chilled-out, nonchalant way. "I'll call you when it's your turn. Take a seat." "I need to see the inspector now," I demanded. "I have to report a murder." Before long, I was being led into the inspector's office, and I sat there nervously, tapping my fingers on the desk and feeling rather apprehensive. Finally, a smart-looking, rather portly officer entered the room. "Sorry to keep you waiting, ma'am," said the officer. "I'm Detective Mathis, pleased to meet you. How can I be of help with you this morning?" "I'm here to report a murder," I said, emptying out the paper bag containing the human hand onto the desk. Detective Mathis's eyes grew as wide as saucers, and he stared in astonishment at the gnarled, withered-looking hand on the table. For a moment he was completely speechless and didn't even say a word, but stared awkwardly at the hand, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was actually seeing. I'm not sure he was used to attaining evidence quite in this way. "Where did you get that?" he asked, looking rather flustered and discomposed. "I didn't get it," I told him. "My dog retrieved it when we went out on a walk in the woods this morning. I pulled it out of his mouth only moments ago in the trunk of the car." "I see," he said, rubbing his chin awkwardly as he studied the hand. "Detective," I continued, "I saw the murderer in the woods." "How do you know he's the murderer?" asked the detective. "Did you see him killing this man?" "No," I said, "but I know he did it. I could tell it was him." "Look, ma'am," said Detective Mathis, "I cannot charge anyone for a murder until I've done a thorough investigation, and I have evidence that the individual that you saw in the woods did indeed perpetrate the crime that you speak of. You have no idea how many murder inquiries I've done over the years with people like yourself telling me they know who did it, when they never saw a thing, nor did they witness the murder. You cannot make erroneous charges and false allegations like this just because you assume he is guilty of this terrible crime. If indeed that were the case, I assure you, our prisons would be full of innocent men locked up because someone like you thought they were responsible for the crime. I operate on facts, ma'am, not on misguided, well-meaning assumptions and accusations." "Officer, you—" "No buts, ma'am. I don't operate on buts. I assure you of that. I'll be getting the force to contain the forest area at once with crime scene tape. We'll then undertake a search with the help of police dogs to ascertain if the rest of the remains are still in the woods. We need to establish who the murder victim is, to notify their next of kin,
and to perform a thorough investigation as to who potentially had motive to murder this man.
But, officer, I protested, you don't understand what I'm trying to tell you. I know that this thing that murdered...
I think I understand more than enough, ma'am, said the officer. Now I'd like you to sit down with the police artist for a moment and allow him to draw a sketch of the suspicious man you encountered in the woods. Leave your details in reception and I'll be in touch with you shortly. At that, he simply walked out of the office with the bag containing the human hand. I was shocked. It would seem like weeks had passed and I hadn't heard a thing from Detective Mathis, so I decided to find out what on earth was going on. I thought it exceedingly rude of Detective Mathis not to be in touch with me, especially as I had brought him incriminating evidence from the murder scene. I was surprised that he hadn't contacted me for further questioning, and I was naturally curious about whether they caught that ghastly critter that was lurking out there in the woods. After I arrived at the police station, Detective Mathis came into the interview room, and he had a very grim, annoyed look on his face. He threw down the artist's sketch of the humanoid ape in front of me. "You think this is funny?" he said, looking at me disdainfully.
"What do you mean, officer?" I said. "That's the creature that I saw in the woods, the one that murdered the man."
"Oh, really?" laughed the officer sarcastically. "You think I was born yesterday? Is this some kind of a sick joke of yours? Is this how you get your kicks, drawing fictitious monsters for police investigations? While I appreciate the fact that you brought the dismembered hand here to the station, I do not enjoy people who waste police time and valuable resources. This is a police investigation. It's not a joke, and it needs to be taken seriously. I find it very offensive that you are treating us this way."
"But that is the creature that committed the murder," I protested. "I saw him in the woods, officer. I'm not making it up. I would never willingly waste police time. I assure you of that."
Detective Mathis seemed to suddenly calm down. "Well, if that is the case," he said, "I do not know what you think you saw there in those woods, but you'll be glad to know that this crime of passion has been solved, and the murderer is now in custody, awaiting trial."
"But, officer," I protested, "that monster I saw, I know it killed him."
"Yes, I suppose you could describe him as a monster, in a manner of speaking," said Detective Mathis. "But he did not look like the monster you got the sketch artist to draw for us. He looked pretty average to me, like any man that you would see walking up and down the street in passing. That's the problem with murderers. They always look normal."
Imagine my horror when I was to discover that the monster that I'd encountered in the woods had actually not been responsible for the murder of this man's dismembered body after all. The corpse was found partially buried in a shallow grave. It appeared that wild animals had been digging up the grave and eating some of the body parts, which is possibly why my dog found the dismembered hand. Officer Mathis told me that the murder happened because of a love triangle between two brothers who were both passionately in love with the very same woman. The younger brother was absolutely furious because his older brother was winning this woman's affection, and when she'd agreed to marry him, he became incensed and incandescent with rage. In a fit of jealous rage, the young brother decided to take out his competition by killing his brother vengefully, and had shot him at point-blank range using a lethal high-caliber rifle. Then he had frozen the body in his deep freezer and dismembered it with an electric saw and packed the parts in black bin liners and subsequently buried them in the woods. "Why those woods?" I asked. "There's so many hiking trails around there. Why would he not just bury his brother in some remote spot where his body could never be found? That's what I would do if I'd murdered someone."
"That's because you're smart and clever. But not all murderers are so discerning like you clearly are," chided Detective Mathis. "I can see you're as bright as a button. I think our haughty, narcissistic murderer was lazy, arrogant and complacent," he continued. "He never believed he would get caught. You know the type, full of his own condescending self-importance. The backyard of his house faces the park that you visit with your dogs, so all he needed to do was to climb over the fence in the middle of the night and bury the body there. The trouble was, in his haste, he got the job done rather too quickly. He didn't bury the body deep enough. If he had applied himself more carefully, No one would have suspected a thing, and he'd have got away with a grisly crime. It would seem that the grave was far too shallow, which was why the wild animals were unearthing it in the first place. They were drawn to the smell of a decaying corpse. It looks like a couple of coyotes had been eating and chewing up some of the body parts. That's why I imagine your dog retrieved the dismembered hand, which you thankfully brought to my station and presented to me on my desk in a way that I am not likely to ever forget.
Do things like this rarely happen? I asked Officer Mathis. I mean, why would he kill his own brother just for the love of a woman? That's crazy. I mean, who does that? Murder their own flesh and blood? I mean, it's appalling. It's despicable.
You'll be surprised how many murders I investigate that are closer to home than you could imagine. And in my experience, jealousy and envy play a pivotal role in many of my murder investigations.
Did he confess to the murder? I asked. I mean, the brother, I mean.
Oh, yes, he did. After a few beers, that garrulous man began to talk and talk and talk. I couldn't even stop him. You see, we have our ways of getting people to spill their guts. I've been doing this kind of work for over 20 years now. I know how to get people to talk, even if I have to engage more crafty methods in my approach. I remember walking away from that police station, hardly daring to believe that the monster that I'd seen in the woods had not been responsible for the heinous crime like I had perceived. So fast forward a few weeks, and I soon learnt that no one had experienced any strange encounters with the mysterious beast that I'd seen in the Sylvan. So I guess whatever he was, he must have been passing through that area. Fortunately, I was once again able to take my dogs back to the lake, but I have learnt this. If you notice the woods becoming menacingly quiet, I'd like to warn everybody who's listening to get out there as fast as you possibly can, because something is in there that you really don't want to encounter, and even the birds become sensitive to the presence of a predator or a monster. That I can assure you of. I quickly shut up about my encounter with the critter, because people think you're completely bonkers when you tell them you've seen something that sounds too spurious to actually be genuine. I only shared my harrowing account with Philippa, who believed my story emphatically, because she perceived how grievously evil the woods seemed on that day. All these years later, I know I encountered a Bigfoot, and if I never see the creature again, it'll be way too soon. So there you are. That's my story. Thank you so much for that incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.